Well, a monument, I imagine, is something like the pyramids or Herzog and de Meron's stadium in Beijing. They're buildings which often are produced by authoritarian regimes, not always. Some even by the British government, which is kind of lightweight authoritarian. And that's nothing to do with my work. You know, as a social democrat, I disapprove of that very strongly. So in response to this invitation to talk about monuments, I decided to make another proposal. And the proposal is this, that there are, in any culture, there are small agreements by which we come together as people unconsciously. And it's the counter to individualism. Hello. It's the counter to individualism. For me, that's very important because we're in a world now of a high level of exploitation, of high level of individualism. In my work, instinctively, it's always been to show people the value of shared views. And that's how I'll speak about 9 projects that I'm going to show. These are the projects. I'll talk briefly about 7 of them, and then I'll talk about these 2 projects in more detail. The first is a competition that we entered a long time ago for a Buddhist retreat in an island off of Scotland. A completely intriguing proposition. I went there, and it's they had a temple which they had built. Scottish people had built it, and it was completely Tibetan. I went to the Tibetan service. I mean, I'm a Buddhist, but I'm from a different area of Buddhism, so this was completely strange to me, but it was rather wonderful. But the retreat center was something else. It was on an island here, which I should attempt to point out. This is the island, and it had the program was to make a place where you arrived by boat, and then here there were 2 retreat centers. And in Tibetan Buddhism, people go on retreat for 4 years. It's very austere. And this was fascinating. So for those buildings at the end, here and here, they're very big. They're very, very big buildings on a place which has never had big buildings. What would they look like from the sea? How would they relate to the landscape around them? Well, this is what they looked like. They had monk cells, meditation cells around a garden here. And then all of this was, sorry, all of this there was a temple and a yoga room. And you can see that in this plan. So these are the cells. There's a garden here, and then a wall around it. And then the natural landscape outside. And a building made of wood, we proposed, which could be built by the monks. They could bring the timber by boat, and they could carry it up the hill, and they could put it on the stone of the island. And so these are some sketches, my sketches of, this is the temple, and that's the way up to the cells. This is the garden in the middle, and that's the building in the landscape. You probably can't see it. The landscape drawn like the Himalayas. I mean, it's not like that. You know, I was having a day there. And what happened here? So Yeah, I'm having a slight problem here, which is it won't go away. I wonder. Yes, here we go. What I'd like to say is that one of these buildings was for men and one was for women. They have the same plan and structure and means of construction, but the land on which they lie shapes them. So for me, this is an analogy of plant life. You'll find a plant which grows differently in one location from another. So it seemed to me that we could make a poetic proposition here as well as one that's functional. And all of the projects that I'll show sacrifice nothing for the ideas that I'm going to describe. They all do the tasks that they should do as an art gallery or another building. The Lisson Gallery, which Oliver mentioned, this is it, and it talks to the building next to it. This was the last building of a row that was ripped down by developers, and so it mirrors this in a way. And this old building has a door to a shop, and this is a door to a shop, and then there's a door that takes you upstairs to an apartment. And so there's a sort of recognition of this last remaining part of the neighborhood. It's important for me, I think, to continue cities, to have continuity, to recognize that the buildings that have gone before were built by people with intent, and they form part of a city. They're buildings that we all use buildings as a way of reinforcing our sense of self. So in the Lisson Gallery, unintentionally, I'll show you the next slide, unintentionally, this reflects the sky and the trees. It also reflects you as you walk by. As you walk by, you look at yourself and wonder how you look and what you're like that day. And in people outside look at people below them. So it was a practical necessity to make this level change. But I believe it has a proper purpose. Most art spaces imply a certain superiority of the clientele. Here, the roles are reversed. You look, passing by the street, you look down on people. The building is a renowned art gallery, and the art spaces are good and liked by artists. But it's a room for a city. In Paris, if you look into a courtyard, you'll see whole areas which you'll never visit, but the city's bigger, and it's important to recognize the value of a building, not just in itself in an enclosed way, but if it can give back to a city, as I'll show, then that reinforces the sense of purpose in an area. And these simple acts of looking or being together, they're very important. They're very important to our sense of community and collectivity. And that's made with a very simple plan. This is the street. This is 6 by 6. And you come in and go down and you rediscover the view. So I'll show a plan with each of these projects to show that it has an architectural construction. On the first floor, it looks out to a school, and a number of artists have embraced that. This is an exhibition by Dan Graham, the American conceptual artist. And Dan chose work specifically to relate to this landscape. Other people have blanked out the view, or made different kinds of relationships. And, am I going backwards? So this is how it adds up as architecture. You know, there's always, behind this, there's always a strong architectural idea, quite often geometric, which comes, it doesn't guide the project, but I find it in the project. One thing that's important to say is that the British mentality is different. It's empirical. It's a very different way of seeing the world, where you look at one thing and you deduce something from it and you continue. And in that sense, it's a conservative culture with a small c. And it's very different, I find, from the cultures in continental Europe, which are much more to do with the principle and ideas. So here's a mixed race football team with our building in the background, being completely ignored by these kids who are just interested in playing football. Buildings can be backgrounds, they can engage. I'll show later a house we did for Anish Kapoor, the artist, and we made a courtyard, which I'll show. And Anish said, surely that should be much more of an explicit object. And I said, let me explain the difference between art and architecture. That really didn't go down very well with an artist like that. But the difference, I said, is that an art object is seen for a very short time in a controlled environment of a gallery, or in Anish's case, when he made that sculpture in Chicago, he knew what it would do to the surroundings. And people see it for a very short time. They might look at it for 10 or 15 minutes and then they'll go away. But a building, you look at the experience all the time, if it's a house. So architecture has to have the ability to sometimes produce aesthetic objects, and sometimes simply to be a background to people's lives. And he said, ugh. And that was the end of that conversation. So here's a tiny project in the countryside in the county of Dorset, and it was for it was a piece of, what was it? It was a country estate which gave itself over to caring for people with disabilities. It did something very interesting, which was that it also had a hotel for people with disabilities. We didn't design that, where carers could leave their charges and go and lead a normal life. And as somebody who's been a carer, I can tell you how good that is. But with this building, it had a different purpose. It could be lots of different things. And interestingly, when we made this building, one of the psychiatrists that work at this place, Holton Lee, said, I'll say something about this building, but you won't like it. And I said, well, what would you say? She said, it's a blank canvas on which I can project anything I want. And I said, that's exactly what I want. So on the one hand, it has to have formal presence and a kind of ambiguity so it can be understood by other people. But it's the only project where we were given the task of positioning it on the site. And we chose this garden with a rather good-looking cottage with a slight rise in the ground. So we could make a building that was the same height as the cottage, not too big, clearly a religious building. And we asked them, what did they want this building to say? And they thought, and they said they simply wanted to make a building where people felt some contact with the natural world around them. And it is a Christian foundation, but it's also a place for other religions. So when you approach this building, you come down a very long road, and it's on the axis of that road. And then there's a field right behind it. You can't see it, but these are very tiny cows being immortalized here. And this actually was this has the hotel for carers. So when you come into the building, you look back on the road you've come to. It's a completely simple religious device, And I thought, that's okay. You've come a long way, you've traveled by car, and then you look back at what you've done. And then, yes, getting it. So it had two rooms, fundamentally. One was a room for quiet contemplation, and it needed a symbol. Symbols are very interesting. For a religious building, you could either be ironic or committed. And since I have a different faith from these people, I chose a symbol that other people could interpret, that had symbolic power, but was open to different understandings by different people. So we made a ring of trees. You'll see it in the plan, but we took trees from the estate and propped them up inside. So it's a very old symbol. It's an enclosing symbol. And then the other room is a room for gatherings, for art installations, for meetings, and it looks out to the fields. And here, the intention was that you would see other life forms, which you do. You see cows and pigs, and you're there having a serious conference, and you find some cattle looking in the window. So it's a sort of shocking revelation that we are not the only creatures on this earth. And here, there's a door which opens to the garden of the hotel for carers, for people with disabilities, so they can use it. So it has a certain flexibility of use. They often will have a party in the garden, and then they'll serve food in here and things like that. So you can open up a building very simply to other interpretations. One of the real vices that we have as architects is to insist upon a certain understanding of our buildings. And I've learned not to do that. You have to constantly open the building for other purposes without being ridiculously over-flexible. In a way, you have to look at older buildings which have adaptability and use that in your own work. And this just is this is the plan. So the entrance was here, and looking back was there. The circle of trees is here, and it has its own small garden, so there's privacy. And then this is the bigger room that looks out, and that's the porch and the garden of the hotel for disabled people. In Den Helder, in Holland when we did this, they had architectural festivals where they built things. I mean, it was very opulent in the 90s, as Oliver was saying. The building culture in Holland was very experimental, and we were in a group of people where they made gestural buildings, and they said, "Why isn't your building radical?" And I said, "It's radical in that it will last 200 years. And they went, okay. So it's still there, I think. But the condition was really interesting. It was, you can't see it, but there's the original 17th century white stucco architecture. And then this is later, less good. And it has a church behind it. And I consciously made this roof rhyme with that church. I mean, I'll show you what it looks like inside, but you can do these things. You can be conscious about how a building might reflect something in its surroundings. And in the entrance hall, there's I mean, this was slightly absurd, but it seems to work. We were working with an executive architect, very talented local architect, who did building restoration, and we needed a storage cupboard. And he said he'd just replicated an 18th century cupboard in the building. Would we like to build that? And we did. We built it. We built this replica of an 18th century cabinet. And as you go by out on your bicycle, you see it, you know. So this strange entrance hall somehow is a factor of the city. And then that top floor looks out over the whole of the city. It's tiny. It's a really small building. You can do a lot with a small building if you work very intensely and have ideas. So here's a section. It's 2 duplexes. Well, it has, this is a store for nearby. It's built on the back of a shop, a big department store. It's a completely compromised site. And this is one apartment, that's another apartment. It has these interlocking staircases, which I mean, you can see how tiny the plan is. Now the question here is, can a house be a social monument? Well, I think it can be in 2 ways. Houses in Venice on a canal, or in Amsterdam, the canal houses, they are social monuments because they're so evident. And like those buildings, there's a piano nobile here, and it has some, you can just about see it from the street, and it's right on the street. You built right on the street. There's a temptation in London, if you're very rich, to gate it and be invisible. But here the client was very aware of the need to have a presence and to, in a way, to reinforce this existing structure of the city where buildings face the street. And there's a garage in the middle with a pneumatic door, which is decorated. So when the door opens, you see a decorated interior, then it closes. And then on one side is the main entrance, and then this is a staff flat. And it's a social monument on the street, but then, as I'll show for the next project, which is the Anish Kapoor House, it's a kind of social monument at the level of a family. Families have structures and the need to come together and not come together. So this is the garden at the back, which you only discover if you go in the house, and a dining room where you can open it to the surroundings and have a garden party and come in, or go up to this room on the first floor, this very large salon, which has the client's painting collection. And then the bay, which you saw, which projects into the street. Now, with a building with windows, as opposed to a building which is all glass, you have a measured relationship with the street. If you choose to sit in the window, to some degree you're visible to your neighbors. If you stand back, you observe your neighbors. And this is what gets lost in buildings which forget the history of building. I'm very fascinated by the way that, say, a door, which was invented thousands of years ago, was changed by somebody, and changed by somebody, and changed by somebody. So building elements like doors and windows contain a lot of social history, and I sense that. So when I design a door, I'm aware of that, its place in that succession of activity. And then on the roof, there's a roof garden, which you see the nature of Chelsea, which is incredibly expensive and very badly organized. And then, so there are a lot, if you have a big house like this, you have to make lots of different spaces where people can sit, where they don't necessarily have to go out each day. So this is the ground floor, the entrance hall, and that's the dining room I showed in the garden. And up here is the roof garden. That's the big room. And it has a sort of mezzanine, which I'll show in section. And it has a tiny room here. So you can escape this big room. You have rooms where you can enjoy scale, and then rooms where you can have a smaller scale. And the section is interesting. That big room has 2 rooms next to it. Just like Palladio in the Villa Malcontenta, around the edge, there are these 2-story height rooms, completely fascinating. And then a room in the middle, which is a room where a family living in the country, an aristocratic family living in the country, would come together, and then places where they would separate. And for Anush, there was a much different house, much more a place where the social construction was internal, and it was a family thing. So in the UK, in London, land prices are absurdly high. So Anish had to buy an apartment building. I'm not showing it, but there's an apartment building here. That's the door to the apartment building. And he bought all the land at the back. So this is his garage, and this is the entrance. So it's very discreet. And you come in through the door that I showed, and then you're in an entrance hall, a long entrance hall. And with long spaces like this, you use reflective surfaces to sustain the daylight. And then looking down that hall, you see the courtyard I mentioned earlier. This is a confusing photograph because it has a Dan Graham sculpture in it. So I'll show you a plan to explain where we are. That's it. You come in there, and then you go down. There's a dining room at the upper level, and then a long living room, a garden, then some steps up, and the bedroom for the parents. And underneath the garden, there's a bathroom. I mean, land prices are so absurd in London. You do lots of intricate work to get value out of them. So, looking at the room, that's the main room, and then there's a stair that goes up to the bedrooms. This is the dining area, and then you come down steps to the living room, and then that's the view on the other side. And then the garden. So there's a garden and a passageway that takes you to the master bedroom, which is like this. That's the passageway, and you look back. So it's a sort of internal social structure, you might say. And this has decided it's going to run itself. I don't know why, but that's the bedroom, and then the bathroom is underneath, and you can see, that's the clear story that next to the garden. But if we go back, we go to the upper floor, and the children's bedrooms are up here. They were young teenagers, so they wanted separation. So this is another courtyard with the family room here, and that's the section. So that's that upper courtyard, children's room, family room, and then all the other things I showed. And that's the only elevation that we designed, which is tiny. But to go back to buildings which have some presence in the city, this is a building we made in Copenhagen on a site here, which for a long time, well, for 150 years was empty. This whole square was part of a longer project that was started 150, 200 years ago, the Frederiksstaden district, where they they built half of it and then stopped because it's in the days when royalty built things and didn't have any money. And in the 1850s or 1880s, a developer called Tietgens completed this end of the square and built the church, which is rather good, and then built these quite compromised Beaux-Arts style apartments around them. They're developers Beaux-Arts, you know. So but what's interesting about them is that they're very pragmatic. The entrances are put in different places. All of the forecourts and corner courtyards are used differently. It's actually been occupied by people and changed by people. And so when we arrived, this building, which had to stay, had a roof garden, an informal roof garden. And so we wanted to complete this square, not in terms of its original form, but in terms of what the society that had lived in it made it. And so we made a building we made this building. It has loges here and apartments, and then it has an entrance here. It has a shop, basically. It has a cafe. And when you're in it, this is the balcony, and then this has really strong views of the surroundings. And I'll use this model to explain what we were doing. This is the pavilion at the end of the square, and this is the building that we made on the site that was empty. And it was a critical view of the Beaux-Arts. Beaux-Arts was a very interesting practice of architecture. It gave the means to make a public space and a building, to be very flexible in where you place an entrance, to give a kind of dignity, and that was very interesting to us. But I didn't want to do something like this, and in fact the client was adamant that they wouldn't tolerate it. It had to be a building of these times. So this building like this has a three-part structure. The balconies here are simply honorific, whereas here they're usable. Here the window is smaller for practical purposes. Here, being a building of modernism, the windows are bigger. In this building, the roof is an attic for servants. Here it's the place that people really want to go because it's a penthouse. So it's a sort of observation of what happened after Beaux-Arts classicism and what happened in modernism. And this is a really lovely photograph by Kjell Vindum, who's a Danish critic, and a really great photographer who just posted this on Instagram, but it's fantastic. I mean, awesomely good photograph. And it shows, I didn't intend this, but it shows some connection between the emblematic church, but it also shows how this house, these older houses, the structure was evident. And so this structure here is evident. So there are certain ways of connecting with the surroundings which are poetic, but also, I'd say, socially based. And I'll just show some plans. This is a floor plan with 2 apartments. This has a tiny south-facing balcony into the courtyard, and then this one has that loggia which you saw, and that's the penthouse, which is rather large, with a very long kitchen. In Denmark also, we made an art museum in a place called Fuglsang, which means birdsong. And to reach it, you travel, it's 2.5 hours south of Copenhagen, so it's not near any city. So you approach it by car, and you arrive in the original courtyard. It's in a farm, So you come in, you park your car outside, and then you walk in. And the original, that's the building. Sorry, I meant to talk more about how you came in. So you came in there, and it has a wonderful barn and a manor house. So a really eclectic mixture of things, which you find in the country. It's country classicism. And the question was, where would we put this building? The competition rules suggested very strongly that it close this courtyard. And we chose not to do that. We chose to put the building here. And the reason we did that is so that when you approach on foot, you don't see the building, you see this landscape. It's a really wonderful landscape, completely flat, that goes into the sea and has a bird reserve on it. And a piece of land that's been made by centuries of cultivation. You know, presumably once it had trees on it, they were uprooted. And so it's a kind of minimalist artifact, you might say. So having seen that view, it's taken away from you, and you enter here into a cafe. And then from that cafe, you see a view of another part of the site, an apple orchard. So the way this building works is the view tells you where you are. Then it's taken away and given back to you in a series of sequences in between the galleries, so that these galleries, which are top lit, and it's not a big museum, but somehow it gives these spaces where you see outside, give you a relief from looking at art, and you can reflect on it. So on one side, there's a corridor gallery which organizes it, and at the end you can see a view of the land. And then there's on this side, there's a group of galleries which are able, they have daylight that can be altered, so that you could show video, film, artworks, sculpture. And then further along on that side, there's a different type of gallery. I should say that the collection, the painting collection, is a permanent collection. So it has artworks in all of the European styles from up to the 70s. So it has Danish Impressionism. So each of the suites somehow responded to that. Specifically, these rooms, which are for paintings from the Danish Golden Age. So small, rather rich. We have a gold ceiling that we put in, and that figure is. You may have noticed that on the outside there were 3 zenithal roof lights, rotated so that when you came in, they didn't coalesce into one form. They were articulated, and these bring light to the floor, but not to the wall. So the lighting is at 50 lux on the wall, and this light can be controlled. So the light comes in and changes on the floor and gives the impression that the whole room is daylit. And at the end of that array is a room for sculpture, which has its own view outside. And one thing I wanted to point out was that in the manor house, it has these decorated ceilings, and it has patterned floors, and they change from room to room. It's really ad hoc. It's been built over a period of years, and each decorateur has made a different interior, but based on a similar theme. And the ceilings and floor in the gallery that we made do something like that. They take like a gridded ceiling and they rotate it. And the aim here is to make a space where it's not as overt as these, it's not as strong as this, but it has character as a room, but it's in the periphery of your vision. And that means you look at the art rather than the architecture. And again, you go here, and there's a room which was the client's idea. It's a very, very good client and a very good brief. And they wanted a room where you would simply sit and look at the land. And it's as I say, for me, this land is a cultural artifact, and it's an artifact as much as the paintings in the gallery. So it attempts, we hope, to show people that it's not just art that's creative, society too is creative. And that room, by chance, relates or rhymes with that small building in the countryside. And then this is what it looks like. From the back, it tends to break up. And the point I want to make is that we think that abstraction is something that came from 20th century modernism, but in fact, abstraction already existed in the vernacular, where a type of building was built, and then gradually, over a period of years, as it was built and rebuilt, it was reduced to its absolute minimum. And these are the plans, just to orientate us. That's how you come in. The gallery that organizes it, the room for viewing the landscape, the smaller rooms, and the sculpture space, and then these two rooms, the sculpture and the cafe, and then all of the back of house entered from there. And then on the upper floor, there's offices and a balcony and a library. So it's very private. You don't really see it from the ground, but it gives the management also a kind of enjoyment of the surroundings. This is the final project. It's a town hall in Deinze, one of the dullest kinds of buildings you could ever design, but we made it provide a welcoming entrance from the city, and that's that entrance. It has two parts to it. There's an office for workers, and then it has a council chamber. And we won this project by saying that the politicians will be on view, publicly on view, and I'll show you how that works. But it, in a rather rough and ready way, it talks to the church over here, but it also talks to this much more simple and not very good street. You know, it's somehow not, it's anti-monumental in a way. You know, it wants to develop its presence from what existed. And all those buildings have been made by people with certain views which are local. And you probably have noticed by now, but there are loges on the building, and this is a means to shade them. So it's a low energy building. It uses ground source heat. And so one purpose of these loges is to shade the facade, but they also provide places for eating out, which is in Belgium, or in this part of Belgium, people take their food to work and they eat together, which is very charming, and they eat on the river. And then in every workspace, there's a door so that you can step out of the office. Offices are like prisons, you know. We don't know it, but we're in a room for 8 hours or 10 hours a day. Isn't it better to have a place where you can just go outside, spend some time not thinking, reflecting, smoke if you want, have a meeting outside? And this is fantastically popular. The mayor is entranced by this idea that there are loges where he can see his city. I mean, it's political for him. But for us, it was a way of humanizing this. You know, so you use a pragmatic element poetically. And the council chamber looked out. They also have weddings in here, which is really splendid. And so it's a real local town hall. Lots of good things happen. And then the politicians can see the city that they serve, and the citizens can see the politicians. And that's what they do. That's really how they operate. You know, they're very, very public. They see this building as a public asset. And I'll just show you the plans. That's the ground floor plan. You come in there are offices, and then all of this ground floor are social services. You come in here, and there's, you know, for quite serious issues of finance and poverty. So it's very discreet, and it has offices around it. And then the upper floors are private. You know, these are council chambers, and each of these are aldermen's offices, and there's an open office. And then that's the council chamber with a very deep south-facing loggia, and politicians and wedding people can hang out in the balcony. You know, so the building facilitates a kind of publicness. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fantastic lecture. I think we will now switch over to ask some questions.
Sure, if people want to ask questions. So people
our
never do.
chance to talk with you.
Absolutely.
And
well.
I would. I need my strange microphone where I don't know exactly where it's useful.
So.
And I'm the first one who is allowed to ask a question. And my question would be, I mean, looking at your lecture.
He has a microphone, but I can't hear it.
Yeah.
It's happening here.
Looking at your lecture, I was wondering, let's say, what kind of role English architectural history plays in your work. So what is something I think you took from the great tradition?
I'm very, what would you say, non-historic, you know, but I look at things. I should say that I have a particular view here. Quite often I'm asked to debate with architectural theorists, and more I say that while I admire architectural theory, it's not what I do. It's not to dismiss it, but what we do as creative workers in this room is something different. We make things. We understand how physical objects can affect people, can make places. That's a skill which theory's forgotten about. What was your question? I've completely lost your question.
We're just wondering about history. English history, let's say. I was just wondering about the English landscape garden, the picturesque.
Well, that's great and very beautiful, but you know, if you're any British architect, you desperately want to escape it, because it's a sort of it's like falling into a bed of marshmallow of beautiful. You know, we all want to be European architects and get out of that. You know, although of course it's wonderful. You can't. You know, I look at Sohn or Adam and fantastic designers. You see them not as history, but as designers. And so I look at the things that have occurred in British architecture before, and I look at it as one designer looking at the work of another designer, and I think either it cultivates me, or I think, what can I do with that? You know, as a designer, you're always looking at, well, I don't know, that's how I do it. You look at the world and you think, there's something there I can see. It doesn't even have to be a good building. It can be a piece of awkward and quite bad building, and you think, I could do something with that, you know? And you, that's how I look at history. If you know my photographs on Instagram, they're about this kind of weird observation. You know, it's I make things and I think about things, and I'm not as cultivated as I should be. You know, I'm not as knowledgeable about English history as I should be. I'm not proud of that, but it's not my capability. My capability is to make intense statements of building. You know, that's what I do. And of course it's influence. It can't be if you didn't understand great works by other people, you'd just be arrogant. You'd be making monuments to yourself, and I won't do that. So yes, of course, you look at the world in which you live. Have you got another question?
I think so. Is there another question?
Yeah, I have a question.
By the way, this
I think you will.
Niklas de Boete, he will tomorrow join our, let's say, our presentation. Is an architect from Antwerp, and he will, by the way, for everybody who will go next week to Antwerp, there will be also visit.
It's a great place, and you'll really like Antwerp.
There will be also a nice visit at the Meta office.
Eat, drink. That's what you do in Antwerp. That's what you do in Antwerp.
Niklas,
and
please.
dig the scene. You know, like there's really wonderful work there. And Ghent, are you going to Ghent?
No.
Oh man, come on.
Only Antwerp. Only Antwerp.
No, you should go to Ghent. It's not that far. No, Ghent with Maurice Chausset's work and Robrecht and Dahm. That's seriously good. So I'm going to get you to take them to Ghent as well. Really?
Yeah, we will also go to Ghent at a certain moment.
Good.
But first, Antwerp. Niklas, please.
Yes, you know Bob van Reet, because I think he was
I do.
with Bob van Reet at the TU Delft. Is it correct?
I wasn't. Well, he was at TU Delft. He came as a sort of practical professor, but he wasn't given much space to be Bob. And I love Bob. I mean, the little I know him. But tell me.
But one of my favorite quotes of Bob is, "Architecture should whisper and not shout." When I see your work, I think that would fit for your work too. It tries to fade in. It tries to disappear and become part of the environment.
No, it's shouting, but very softly. You know. I mean, I am an architect. The way I've explained to you is in response to an invitation to talk about monumentality, but I make it. I mean, if it didn't have architectural intent, it really would disappear. You know, so it has to have some architectural punch. Otherwise, forget it. If you're telling me it's fading into history, then I'm really depressed. You know, after all these years of making architecture, suddenly you're saying it's invisible. I just have to think about this.
No, not invisible, but in the sense that I think one of the values of good architecture is that you pass it 10 times and only the 11th time you say, hey, this a very interesting building here. So, but if it's in your face, it demands all the attention every time you pass, then for me it's
okay.
Annoying.
We as architects often don't have any gradations of scale. There's, in music, for example, people like John Cage would make pieces that had very slight presence, but actually enormous experiential range. It's intelligent to sometimes accept that your building is playing a minor role, but in playing a minor role, it can be very significant. It doesn't have to be minor in playing a minor role. The building in Copenhagen, in the square, there was, I mean, some people would have made a building which challenged the church. That I didn't want to do. I wanted to make something that spoke to the surroundings, the surroundings of the church. That's a specific role, and it's not immodest. It's not modest to do that. It's just intelligent to know where your building, what presence your building should have in any one situation. In the museum in Denmark, it's very powerful, visually very powerful, because it should be. It shouldn't disappear. But at the same time, it also talks, you know, the whiteness of it talks to the white barn. So it aims to work with what exists and be powerful.
Yeah, but there's definitely a difference between a public building and a housing project, which if every house should shout, it would be very,
yeah, well, housing is one of the most difficult things to get architectural expression in, you know, because it's so modest. We're beginning to get housing in England, you know, after all these years we're doing housing in England, and there's so little architectural expression in it. You can't make the kind of statements in British housing that I've been able to make in housing in Holland, or where there was an appetite. I haven't shown you these projects, but there's an appetite for really statement buildings, and that's the UK. It's so modest, you can't believe it. So what you have to do is you have to think, what kind of people would like it? And they won't be people with architectural taste, although I'll come back to that. There'll be people who have a different kind of taste. Can you appeal to that? We made a housing scheme in the country. I designed it. There was a road into it. It was a cul-de-sac, as we say. And all the houses looked out onto this. And I thought, this would be a perfect place for children to play. And all the back gardens could look into this space. And then every single house was bought by a retired art bureaucrat with no children. So what can you do? It's a kind of mystery, building housing.
So I'm interested in the role of art and how important art is for you, because when reading your book, AEIOU,
yeah,
you're mentioning a lot that art is important for you.
Chris is saying that art's important for me. Well, it is, and it was when I was designing the Lisson Gallery. It was very, very important, because those artists in the Lisson Gallery, which were British artists like Anish Kapoor, but also American artists like Dan Graham, it was a fantastic period. I mean, that was in the 90s, amazing period of before art became commodified in the way that it is now. And so that was really important. And I also worked for a short while as a performance artist. I mean, a very amateur one. And it let me see that the material that performance was using, spaces, objects, was the same material that we used as architects. But very naturally, for performance artists, through their position as conceptual artists, they could show the ideas in these objects. And I thought, well, I could do that in architecture. But now, no, I don't feel that so much. I mean, because the art that I liked, there's nobody looking at it anymore. So I look at, when I get insomnia, which I do quite a lot, I look at books of painting or photography. I've spent a lot of time now looking at photographers like Josef Koudelka and trying to understand photography. And I now understand that I wouldn't be any good at it, so I won't do it. This was the project. If I lost my eyesight, I could become a photographer. Well, no, that doesn't work. But do you know that Matisse spent ages learning the violin so that if he became blind, he could make a living? As creative beings, I do have the kind of weirdest of thoughts. And for all I thought I might, if we ran out of business, I might be a photographer. But actually, to be a good photographer, you have to devote your life to it in the same way as I've devoted my life to architecture. So I'll be an architect, and the photographs that I take are an architect taking photographs. But I look at art, I look at painting quite a lot. I don't know why. I don't know why I do that. And sometimes you don't have to know. I also listen to music. I listen to lots of John Coltrane. You won't know these guys, but and he'll play something, and it will let me see a possibility, not in architecture, but it will let me see the way that an artist takes a chance. Is that a question at the back, or?
Good.
Yeah, great. Okay, I'll come to you. I remember reading in one of my books on photography, I think it was the photographer Lee Friedlander heard Charlie Parker play. I mean, this is ancient history to you, but Parker completely changed jazz. And Friedlander said, I realized that anything was possible by listening to Charlie Parker. So you can look at other art forms, not to take something from them formally, but from courage. And so that's really what I'd say about art. That's my way of looking at art. I look at it in the same way as I look at everything. You know, can I use this? But sometimes not. Sometimes I do it just because I like it. I like looking at paintings. I keep buying books. It's, you know, the places like Francis Bacon's studio, you know, stuff all over the floor. It drives me crazy. My cleaner's got a tiny space now. That's art. Was there a question, or are you stretching? Okay, you might need to talk out because I am quite deaf, you know.
Maybe you can just come.
And but the room acoustics work this way, you know, for me to project to you. But do you want to?
Please come here.
And do you want to go and stand next to her? And this is, I don't want to embarrass her. Hey, thank you for your question.
So I was interested, just connecting to what you just said about you being interested in photography, because I get the feeling that you stage the outside. So the view from the inside to the outside is really staged and really presented in a very special way. So you have to choose the proportions of the window, the proportion of the lens of what you see. And it's quite impressive. Also choosing the spot where to place the room, to then have the spot to place the window, and then the proportions of the window. Do you have questions or discussions with your investors about the size of your windows?
Because not usually. I mean, no, it's okay. It's a great question. In an art gallery, that's not an issue. The question is it a great art space? But in housing, you have a much greater series of constraints, and you have to find a way to work with them to get the expression. And in my office, my colleagues will design a project before I get near it, and I'll say, well, we need to do this, and they say, well, you can't do that because of this. And so I spend a lot of time finding the architecture in a very, very constrained situation. If you don't do that, your office is just like anybody else's. You know, we're not in practice just to make money. We don't make any money. We make some money, but so there's no point in being overwhelmed by constraints. You have to persuade your investors. Sometimes it's awful to say, but as a professional, I don't discuss architecture with my clients. We'll always talk pragmatically or in terms of use. And very occasionally they'll say, I like that. And you say, well, this is why we did it. But mostly you don't do that. You know, you deal with your client in their own terms. And then your obligation as an architect is to produce architecture from that. You know, the nature of architecture is it's a profession. Professions are very different from making money or being an investor. Professions like being a doctor, being a lawyer, being an architect, there's always a wider social interest. You know, whatever you do for a client, it always has to benefit society. You don't say that, but it's built into being a professional. Does that make some sense, what I'm saying?
How do you choose the
It's
proportion?
completely intuitive, but it's able to be built. You have to know that you can build it. But my proportional system isn't. It's not numerical. Peter Merkley, who I know, says that he works by a series of proportional relationships. I just, you know, that's cool for him, not for me. I just look at it and think about that big, I think. When we did the Red House, we made a model at 1:50, and we kind of chopped the facade apart until it looked the way we wanted. Then we measured it and did the working drawings from the model. You know, you start with what you want to deliver, and then you make it happen. So I look at things. I have a particular sense of proportion, I'm told. And your observation of art photography is right. But I didn't know that while I was doing it. I know it now. Now that I look at photographs, and how a photographer makes a photograph by framing, by choosing certain ways of framing. Now I understand what I've been doing.
Maybe one more question. I'm a big fan of your Instagram.
Hey.
It's a very enjoyable profile.
Hi.
Maybe you can talk a bit about your thoughts on Instagram in general and whether you consume it and how.
Well, I was fairly innocent. I used to put photographs on Twitter, and then I know, and then this was before what's his face bought it, and then I realized that everybody else is on Instagram, and I thought, that's interesting. What's Instagram? So I looked at it and I thought, I'll just put some photographs on it. So I didn't really, I mean, if I look at other Instagrammers, there's a huge range from sort of nonsensical, lots of photographs of dogs in woolly hats and things like that. Lots of photographs of animals eating each other. So there's a kind of curious threads of interest in Instagram. But for some reason, I can make it work as a series of observations. I photograph things almost every day, and then I immediately put them on Instagram. And the minute I've taken the photograph, I put them on Instagram. I mean, I'll look at it to make sure it's a good photograph. And I take photographs when I go to the gym to work my ailing body. You know, I keep fit. There's parts of that route which are full of photographs. I don't know why, and it's interesting. The American photographer Gary Winogrand, who I really like, said there were certain parts of New York or Manhattan which he photographed in because there were certain types of people and certain types of backgrounds. And you realize that a street photographer finds places. There are not photographs everywhere. There are photographs in some places, you know. Stephen Bates said, how do you take photographs? It looks like you just don't care. And I said, no, I do. And I said, let me show you. There were some chairs. And I said, this is what you do. And he went, and he just didn't get it, you know. So, but you have to when you take photographs, you have to see a photograph. You can't just photograph at random. You start to think photographically. What can photography do? I mean, it's as fraught as any other art form, and very out of date. I mean, people do take photographs, but so in a way, to put them on Instagram, it means no gallery would be interested in them. Although I have had an exhibition of my photographs, which was attended by 4 people. That was interesting. That was an interesting experience. What do you do with something that you've done? As a creative being, you want an audience. As an architect, you want to work with other people or work for other people. So Instagram's perfect. It goes out into the ether, and you've no idea who looks at it. Well, you do because people like, and so I've really always been interested in the digital world. You know, I played in a band about 100 years ago, and we used to give cassettes away. You know, we wanted to. There's infinite reproducibility. The exhibition of drawings I had at the gallery were of. There's a gallery in London called Betts Projects, which is run by it's a great gallery, always on the edge of kind of collapse financially. And Marie Coulon, who runs it, said, I want to do an exhibition of your work. And I said, all right. And she wanted to do a limited edition of things like the drawings for Fuglsang. And I said, well, no, I've got something more interesting. I've got these drawings I drew with my finger on an iPad. And she said, well, okay. So I sent her about 50 drawings, and she said, but they're so small. And I said, yeah, they're only about 4 kilobytes, you know. And she said, what am I going to do with them? I said, well, we're printing them very small. And the exhibition was called Minis. So people bought them. I suppressed the price. They're only £50 framed. and I gave all the profits to Marie, which she's forgotten about. But so I'm very interested in giving work away. I'm not really interested in uniqueness, and I'm much more interested in things like this, in communication. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to go.
Any more questions?
Unless there are any more questions, I'm going to go. There's one at the back.
Can you please come here? It's the best.
It's
because otherwise we cannot understand you.
well, I can't hear you. That's the problem. It's kind of you to come. I could come to you. Actually, this is the thought. I could have come to you. The next question, or I'll come to them. I'm going to sit down.
I think it is quite refreshing to see that you aim to establish some kind of visual connection with the surrounding
Yeah.
in your work. Accordingly, I wanted to ask, how do you balance the relationship between the abstraction and familiarity of material or form? So what are the limits of this relationship in your work in terms of belonging to place?
Well, abstraction is very important, because if you're like me, you want to absorb buildings that exist. This is an artistic maneuver we're talking about. It's not. If you want to look at things that you like, but you don't want to reproduce them, so that you don't make things that look like things that already exist, but you want to make things that are estranged from the things that you like, but still have connections, which have, let's say, a greater degree of ambiguity, then you abstract them. And instinctively, I abstract things. I mean, what I need to say is that as a designer, you have lots of drives you don't really understand, and that gives the character of your work. And it's interesting for all of you as students to acknowledge your tastes and drives. You know, they're what makes you an architect. All the other stuff of building properly, and that's all good. But if you want to make something that communicates with somebody else, something that is architecture, then you have to listen to your own voices and look at and recognize what you look at and see it as a formation in you as an artist. See, I think architecture's got two responsibilities. One is to be useful in a good sense, you know, to be properly planned, but also to be satisfying. That's another form of use. But at the other end, it has an obligation to visual culture. And that's the part that clients don't understand. Nobody understands but architects. And in a way, we haven't to be too shy about that, because if we don't let ourselves have that right to make part of visual culture, as well as making a building that works and is beautiful, there won't be any architecture. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Great, okay. So what you like is important. Let it happen. Let it happen. It will take some time for it to develop into an architectural position. Draw, think, photograph, collect things that interest you, and eventually it will inform your work. Yeah.
Based on your last answer, what would be your position on the saying that there can be architecture without architects?
Say it again. Sorry.
Based on your last answer, what is your position on the saying that there can be architecture without architects?
That's a proposition that Bernard Rudavsky made some time ago about buildings which come through a long process of, let's say, vernacularization. And that's very valuable work. But can we really wait for 1,000 years to make what we need to make? We have to recognize that we, as architects, have to do things. And a lot of vernacular architecture you just can't reproduce. You cannot, you know, because society's changed, materials have changed, there's legislation. A lot of vernacular buildings don't work. I was in Mallorca once in a stone house in the winter, and it leaked like crazy, and it was wet and awful. So not all vernacular architecture works. So it's building. That's building. Architecture is a more willed thing, which does, as I say, have aim to have a connection with visual culture.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome. I'm going to go. Thank you, everybody.